In today's video, we're breaking down the 5 dumbest animal attacks ever recorded. From a teenage hiker trying to intimidate a wild cougar, to a man who rubbed fish bait on his chest and walked into shark-infested waters. But first, we begin at the edge of Anchorage, where a man with more confidence than common sense tried to mediate a fight between 2 grizzly bears using a trash can lid. It was July 4th, 2016, a quiet summer morning on the wooded outskirts of Anchorage. 67-year-old Howard Tiller stepped barefoot onto his back porch to enjoy the peaceful air, occasionally broken only by birdsong through the towering spruce trees. But at the tree line near his weathered shed, 2 massive grizzly bears, drawn by the sweet scent of unsecured garbage bags, were circling each other with increasing aggression. Howard was a retired machinist with a stubborn streak and a dangerous sense of familiarity with wildlife. Living alone on 5 unfenced acres, he treated animals like neighbors, feeding strays and chasing off moose with a broom. He scoffed at bear warnings and refused protective gear, convinced that loud voices and calm gestures worked better than spray or firearms. This stupidity, honed for decades, would be his undoing. Over time, neighbors grew used to watching Howard chase off animals with nothing but loud shouts or household objects. His success turned into a local myth, and from a distance, some even watched the sport. Many believed he had a special understanding of wildlife, and eventually, so did he. That fatal morning, as the 2 grizzlies growled over the trash pile behind his shed, garbage bags he'd left out overnight despite repeated warnings from wildlife officials, Howard responded as he always had. A neighbor spied him grabbing a metal trash can lid and walked down his gravel path like it was any other Tuesday. What Howard fatally underestimated was the sheer destructive power of the predators treating his backyard like their personal territory. Grizzly bears are among North America's most formidable predators, with adult males weighing up to 800 pounds and possessing the strength to flip over boulders weighing several hundred pounds. Their massive paws, equipped with claws of up to 4 inches long, can decapitate a moose with a single swipe. When defending food sources or feeling threatened, grizzlies become killing machines driven by millions of years of evolutionary programming. His approach was unchanging: create noise, show dominance, and interrupt what he assumed was just a territorial struggle. Another neighbor across his property later described hearing Howard shouting in a firm and familiar voice, barking out orders as if he were trying to shoo away stray dogs. Howard advanced to within 15 feet of the feeding bear, slamming the lid like a cymbal and swinging it over his head in what he believed would come across as threatening. The younger bear reacted with alarm, crashing into the brush in a panicked retreat. But the larger male stayed firmly in place, intent on finishing its meal. This particular bear had been interrupted mid-feeding and showed visible signs of past battles that had likely left it on edge and hyper-defensive. Bears that become conditioned to human food often stop fearing people entirely and instead come to see them as rivals. As Howard continued his approach, undeterred by the bear's warning posture, the animal made a sudden lethal decision. People watching said the grizzly charged without hesitation, closing the distance in less than 3 seconds. Howard managed to lift the trash can lid in a weak attempt to shield himself, but the bear smashed through it effortlessly. The lid clattered onto the gravel, useless, as the full force of the bear's bulk threw Howard backward and pinned him instantly. The autopsy later cited that the bear's jaws crushed Howard's thigh, its canines snapping his femur and tearing deep into muscle. His shouts turned to screams as claws ripped open his chest and stomach. Weighing nearly 10 times more, the grizzly pinned him effortlessly and kept attacking. Residents, drawn out by the commotion, watched in stunned silence as the bear dragged Howard's limp, bloodied body into the brush. One neighbor, witnessing it through binoculars, called 911 as it unfolded. Within seconds, both man and animal disappeared into the trees. All that remained was scattered trash, crushed foliage, and streaks of blood. When authorities arrived 40 minutes later with tranquilizers and tracking gear, the bear was gone. They found Howard's body in a shaded clearing just 40 yards from his porch, torn open with the unmistakable violence of a grizzly kill. A trail of blood through crushed ferns and matted grass marked the brutal path he'd been dragged. Investigators found used bear spray and a whistle just feet away inside his porch, dismissed as unnecessary. The incident spurred renewed efforts to educate Alaskans on food waste and the dangers of wildlife habituation. A small memorial service was held 4 days later at the Anchorage Cremation Center, attended by a few close neighbors and his brother, who flew in from Montana to scatter Howard's ashes near the porch he had once considered safe. Howard tried to referee a bear fight with a trash can lid. Meanwhile, a teen in Washington walked straight toward a wild cougar, staring it down like it was some kind of game. It was August 7, 2015. While the pine-scented air hung still over Washington's Wenatchee National Forest, a group of high schoolers moved single file along a narrow ridge trail, their voices echoing softly through the towering evergreens. Most were participating in a weekend leadership retreat, but 17-year-old Owen Carver had his own agenda brewing beneath his confident exterior. Owen was the kind of teenager who commanded attention without asking for it. With his brown hair and cocky grin, he had cultivated an image as the group's resident survivalist. His social media account featured dozens of videos where he demonstrated danger drills and talks about dominance over wildlife. His followers, mostly classmates and friends, hung on every word as he explained how predators only go after prey that acts afraid. He thought confidence was a substitute for caution, proof his foolishness didn't understand what real danger looked like. That afternoon, while the group rested at a scenic clearing, Owen's restless energy got the better of him. His classmates mentioned he had been chafing under the adult leader's constant reminders to stay close, likely viewing their caution as weakness rather than wisdom. His phone battery was running low, but he said he wanted one more video, unaware that it would be his last one. As they wandered toward a rocky outcrop, movement caught his eye. Beneath a shaded ledge, partially concealed by shadows and scrub brush, a large cat stared back at him with unblinking golden eyes. The cougar was magnificent, easily 6 feet long from nose to tail, its tawny coat blending perfectly with the rocks. Two of Owen's friends, Jake and Madison, had followed him despite the leader's instructions to stay put. They stopped short when they spotted the predator, their faces draining of color. The cougar remained motionless, crouched low with its head slightly tilted, tail twitching. Jake muttered a curse and stepped back. Owen, grinning, told them to stay put. He was about to win a staring contest with a mountain lion. He believed holding eye contact showed dominance and refusing to back down was a sign of control. But anyone who actually understood wild animals would have called it a sign of stupidity. What Owen mistook for calmness in the cougar's posture was in reality the silent tension of a predator sizing up a potential threat. The twitching tail wasn't a casual flick, it was a clear warning, well documented in wildlife behavioral studies and often a precursor to attack. In most cases, cougars avoid human contact, but when they feel cornered or challenged, their response is immediate and brutal. Mountain lions, also known as cougars or pumas, are stealthy apex predators. Weighing up to 220 pounds, they can leap 15 feet vertically and 40 feet horizontally with 2-inch retractable claws and a 400 psi bite. Most critically, cougars are ambush predators, evolved to kill quickly and silently, typically targeting the neck and spine to ensure an instant kill. Owen began moving slowly toward the animal. He kept his gaze locked on the cougar's eyes. His arms relaxed at his sides in what he assumed was a stance of dominant calm. Each step brought him closer to a wild animal that had already made up its mind. When he came within 15 feet of the ledge, the cougar's body tensed like a coiled spring. According to Jake and Madison, the attack happened almost faster than the group could register. The big cat launched forward in a single violent leap. Owen managed to lift up his arms and let out a shout, but the cougar's paw struck him across the face with brutal force, sending him crashing backward onto the rocks. The animal landed squarely on top of him, jaws locking around his neck in a killing hold honed by millennia of evolution. The bite targeted the spine and major arteries, ensuring a swift death while minimizing the cougar's exposure to risk. Jake and Madison screamed, frozen by the sight of their friend being dragged toward the brush. They turned and ran down the trail, shouting for help as their cries echoed through the forest. It took nearly 30 minutes for rangers to reach the site, guided by the teens' panicked directions and screams. When they arrived, the cougar was still nearby, pacing in a tight circle near Owen's body with its ears flattened. Classic territorial behavior indicating it was prepared to defend what it considered its kill. He had already died from the initial attack. The rangers were forced to euthanize the animal on the spot, following standard protocol for a confirmed human fatality. A healthy adult male, the cougar had not been hunting Owen as prey, but had likely been startled by his confrontational approach. Owen's death sent ripples through outdoor education communities and led to renewed scrutiny of wilderness safety practices. Hours before the attack, his final Instagram post showed him smiling at the camera with a caption boasting about showing up the less experienced students and promising dramatic footage from the day's hike. His funeral was held the following week at a small church in Tacoma, where friends, classmates, and stunned trip leaders gathered to remember a teenager known for his energy, confidence, and unshakable belief that he could handle anything nature threw his way. Owen tried to stare down a cougar like it was a challenge, and with increased bravado, a man in Florida stripped off his shirt and yelled at an 11-foot alligator just to prove a point to his ex. It was July 20th, 2022 when the air hung thick and oppressive over central Florida's Lake Hachanilla. The backyard barbecue at the Hendersons' lakeside property had been winding down for hours, but the combination of beer, old grudges, and summer heat had transformed what should have been a peaceful gathering into something far more volatile. At the center of the brewing storm stood Zach Renner, his face flushed red from alcohol and humiliation. Zach was a 29-year-old construction worker from Kissimmee, known among his circle for his impulsive decisions and inflated sense of his own capabilities. His social media showed a pattern of escalating stunts, leaping off overpasses, wrestling pit bulls, even grabbing a rattlesnake barehanded. Raised by a hard-working single father who prized toughness and rarely intervened, Zach learned early on that attention, even through dumb recklessness, was its own kind of validation. The evening had started pleasantly enough, with grilled burgers and cold beers flowing freely among the dozen or so friends gathered on the Hendersons' dock. But as the sun set and inhibitions lowered, old tensions began to surface. The breaking point came when Zach's girlfriend of 2 years, Jessica, announced in front of everyone that she was done with his childish crap and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the water's edge. The humiliation was too much for Zach's fragile ego to bear. His friends watched as his face cycled through embarrassment, anger, and finally a dangerous kind of determination. Earlier in the evening, someone had mentioned spotting what looked like a large alligator near the boat ramp, but the sighting had been dismissed as probably just a log or debris. Zach shouted, slurring slightly as he pointed toward the dark water, that he was going to find the gator and ride it like a cowboy. He said he'd show everyone what a real man looked like. To him, it was a stunt for laughs and bragging rights. To everyone else, it was another reminder that Zach never understood where confidence ended and stupidity began. His friends initially laughed, assuming it was just drunken bravado, but as Zach began stripping off his shirt and stumbling toward the water's edge, their amusement turned to alarm. Several people called out for him to stop, but Zach was beyond reason, driven by a toxic combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and the need to prove something to people who were no longer paying attention. Thinking before acting had never been his strong suit. What Zach didn't know was that local anglers had recently reported an unusually large male alligator, estimated at 11 feet long, prowling this particular stretch of Lake Hachanina. Wildlife officials suspected the animal had been pushed into the narrower bay by territorial disputes with other males during mating season. American alligators are ancient predators, with instincts honed over millions of years. Adult males can grow up to 14 feet long and weigh over 1,000 pounds, delivering a bite strong enough to crush a bowling ball. Their 80 razor-sharp teeth form a grip that, once locked, is almost impossible to escape. As Zach moved deeper, the water rose to his chest, the soft, uneven lake bottom slowing his steps. He slapped the surface and shouted taunts, unaware of the danger. His friends watched in uneasy silence, some filming, hoping it was just another stunt. Little did they know, something beneath the surface had already begun to shift. The alligator had been likely watching from the moment Zach entered the water. Concealed among the reeds just 20 feet away, the massive reptile remained perfectly still, only its eyes and nostrils breaking the surface. To the predator, Zach's splashing and shouting weren't intimidating, they were an announcement of prey in distress. The attack came without warning. One moment Zach was chest deep in the murky water, still yelling taunts at the darkness. The next, the surface exploded as nearly half a ton of prehistoric predator surged forward with devastating speed. The alligator's massive jaws clamped around Zach's midsection with bone-crushing force, the impact audible even over his single terrified scream. What followed was a textbook death roll, the alligator's signature killing technique. The massive reptile spun rapidly in the water, using its entire body weight to disorient its prey and cause massive internal trauma. The water around them erupted in a violent whirlpool of foam and red, as Zach's body was twisted and torn by forces no human could survive. Chaos broke out on the dock. Jessica screamed and collapsed as others shouted Zach's name into the silent water. One guy stepped in to help but froze when the alligator surfaced, Zach's limp body in its jaws before vanishing into deeper water. All they could do was call for help. Emergency services arrived within the hour, but everyone knew it was a recovery operation, not a rescue. The lake was immediately closed to the public while wildlife officials began the grim task of locating both the victim and the predator responsible. The alligator was found and euthanized the following day, its stomach contents confirming what everyone already knew. Zach's remains, what could be recovered, were returned to his family for burial. The incident made local news, with a few outlets treating it as another example of Florida man's stupidity. In the days following the attack, Florida Fish and Wildlife officials closed off access to the lake and posted new warning signs around the perimeter. They also launched a community outreach campaign on the dangers of feeding or approaching wild alligators, emphasizing how quickly such behavior can lead to fatal outcomes. After this lakeside dare ended with Zach in a gator's jaws, a backyard zookeeper walked into her enclosure carrying lasagna, convinced affection could outweigh instinct. It was October 25, 2017, when the autumn air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke across Marlene Brickshaw's property just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The 58-year-old retired librarian stood at her kitchen window watching two massive black bears lumber around the chain-link enclosure she had built with her own hands 3 years earlier. What began as a rescue mission for two orphan cubs had turned into something far more dangerous than Marlene ever expected. Marlene was the kind of woman who collected stray cats, fed wild deer from her back porch, and believed deeply that animals could sense the purity of human intentions. Her neighbors knew her as the eccentric lady who lived in what she called Little Ark, a wooded property cluttered with bird feeders, rescue dog kennels, and now a makeshift bear habitat that had become the talk of the county. Her clothes perpetually bore the stains of whatever animal she was currently nursing back to health. 3 years earlier, wildfires in northern Arizona left 2 black bear cubs orphaned. Marlene, following the rescue efforts, applied for a wildlife permit and convinced authorities to let her take them in, claiming she had rehab experience in proper facilities. Her so-called proper facilities were a 40 by 60 foot chain link pen she built behind her house, roofless with no backup barriers or safety protocols. A single gate opened straight into the enclosure, offering no secure way to feed or separate the bears. It wasn't just unsafe, it was flat out stupid. The kind of setup no trained professional would ever go near without sounding the alarm. For 3 years, Marlene hand-fed the bears daily, referring to them affectionately as her boys, Bruno and Baxter. She would enter their enclosure with buckets of food, talking to them in the same gentle voice she had once used to calm nervous library patrons. Local reporters occasionally featured her story as a heartwarming example of human-animal bonding, and Marlene basked in the attention, unaware of her recklessness. What Marlene interpreted as trust was actually learned behavior. The bears associated her presence with food, nothing more. As the cubs grew into 300-pound adults, neighbors began expressing concern about the increasingly inadequate enclosure and Marlene's casual approach to safety. The bears had been spotted standing on their hind legs against the fence, their massive paws easily reaching over the top of the chain link barrier. Black bears can range in color from cinnamon to black, with adult males reaching up to 600 pounds. Their 4-inch claws and 800 psi bite force make them capable of crushing bone and tearing flesh. Though omnivorous and often unpredictable, even hand-raised bears retain wild instincts and can turn violent without warning. Having one in your property leaves no room for stupidity. By fall 2017, one of the bears, Bruno, the larger of the two, had begun showing signs of food aggression, particularly when meals were delayed or when Marlene approached with smaller portions than expected. Bears in captivity often develop resource guarding behaviors, especially when their feeding schedule becomes irregular. That October afternoon, Marlene was running nearly 2 hours late for feeding, delayed by a call from her sister. She loaded a tray with leftover lasagna, rolls, and fruit, then headed toward the pen. Security footage showed her carrying the food in both hands as she approached the enclosure. She wore no protective gear, no gloves, no face shield, nothing to shield her. The enclosure lacked a drop cage or buffer gate for safe feeding. It was just Marlene, a tray of food, and 2 restless 300-pound bears. As she stepped inside, whistling her usual greeting, Bruno was already pacing near the gate. His body language, tense movements, fixated stare on the food, ears flattened, was a clear warning. These were textbook signs of a bear gearing up to dominate a meal. She barely had time to register any of it before Bruno lunged. He struck her in the chest with a force that lifted her off her feet, sending her crashing onto the hard-packed earth. The tray clattered from her hands, lasagna and fruit scattering across the dirt as her screams filled the cage. What followed was brutal and efficient. Bruno's powerful jaws clamped down on Marlene's face and neck, his teeth designed for crushing bone and tearing flesh. As she struggled weakly beneath his massive weight, he began dragging her toward a shaded corner of the enclosure, a behavior that wildlife experts recognize as a bear's instinct to protect and consume its kill away from potential competitors. Her screams carried across the wooded property to her nearest neighbor, Jim Kowalski, who was working in his garage nearly 200 yards away. He immediately called 911, but the remote location meant that emergency responders faced a lengthy drive on winding mountain roads. By the time sheriff's deputies and wildlife officials arrived 2 hours later, Marlene was beyond help. Bruno stood over her partially consumed remains, blood matting his dark fur, while Baxter cowered in the far corner of the enclosure. The scene was so horrific that several first responders required counseling afterward. Bruno was euthanized on site, while Baxter was tranquilized and eventually transferred to a legitimate wildlife sanctuary in Colorado, where he would live out his days behind proper barriers with trained professionals. The investigation revealed numerous safety violations and highlighted the dangers of amateur wildlife rehabilitation. Arizona Game and Fish Department spokesman Mark Hart summed up the tragedy succinctly that love is not a safety protocol. Wild animals, regardless of how they're raised, retain their predatory instincts and unpredictable nature. Marlene was dragged off by a bear she raised like a dog, but at least she misunderstood that trust. Meanwhile, a fisherman in Galveston coated himself in anchovy paste and waded straight into shark-infested water. It was March 17, 2018, and the Gulf Coast waters were calm as Craig Millen stepped ankle-deep into the surf before sunrise. The 52-year-old commercial fisherman from Galveston had been walking these beaches since childhood, his weathered hands and sun-damaged skin telling the story of decades spent battling wind, salt, and tide. But Craig's latest obsession would prove to be his undoing. Craig was known among his fishing circle for his eccentric habits and deep distrust of anything manufactured or store-bought. Craig's garage was packed with driftwood lures, rope-braided lines, and jars of his homemade sunscreen. A mix of cod liver oil, crushed anchovies, and street herbs. He slathered it on daily, ignoring friends' complaints that he smelled like a rotting bait bucket. Even among seasoned anglers, his methods pushed well beyond common sense. Craig's homemade sunscreen wasn't just ineffective, it was essentially a dinner bell for every predator within miles. The cod liver oil and crushed anchovies created a scent trail that would carry on the current like a highway leading directly to him. But Craig dismissed such concerns with the confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong by nature's harsh lessons. He insisted that sharks were drawn to motion, not scent, and often waved off the shark incident reports posted near the Galveston Pier. According to Craig, the idea that blood attracts sharks was just Hollywood nonsense. In his view, staying calm and avoiding splashing was all it took to stay safe. That March morning, Craig skipped his usual waders, saying they were too hot for the warm weather. Wearing only swim trunks and his worn fishing vest, he coated himself in his homemade sunscreen, the oily mix glistening as he waded into the murky water. It was the kind of setup that ignored every basic rule of safe shoreline fishing. His friend Danny, standing on the shore a few yards away, watched with mild amusement. A recent storm had left the Gulf murky with near zero visibility. What Craig didn't see and what biologists have been tracking was a group of 4 to 6 foot juvenile bull sharks prowling the shallows, drawn by the disoriented prey stirred up by the rough surf. Bull sharks are among the world's most dangerous, second only to great whites in human attacks. They can reach 11 feet, weigh over 500 pounds, and deliver a bite force of 1,300 psi. Able to thrive in both salt and fresh water, they often hunt in shallow areas where people swim, and their powerful sense of smell lets them detect blood at 1 part per billion. Texas Parks and Wildlife had issued advisories about increased shark activity, but Craig rarely paid attention to official warnings. He preferred to trust his own experience and instincts, which would be his undoing. As Craig waded waist-deep into the chocolate-colored surf, his scent trail spread like an invisible cloud through the water. The combination of fish oils and organic compounds created an olfactory beacon that registered immediately on the sensitive chemoreceptors of every predator in the area. To a bull shark, Craig didn't smell like a human, he smelled like prey in distress, wounded and vulnerable. Within minutes of casting his first line, it happened. Danny saw Craig jerk violently to one side, then scream, a sharp guttural sound that shattered the calm. A 5-foot bull shark had struck from below, ramming Craig's left thigh and clamping down with a suddenness that stunned even Danny, who stood frozen at the waterline. Craig thrashed and tried to retreat, but the shark held fast. Bull sharks don't nibble, they grip, twist, and tear. As it shook its body, flesh and blood fanned out in the waves. Craig screamed again, then fell forward, struggling to stay upright. Danny ran toward the water but stopped short, helpless. The water around Craig had turned red. In under 30 seconds, it was over. The shark let go and vanished. Craig collapsed sideways into the surf, his face twisted in agony, blood pouring from a gaping wound where the femoral artery had been torn open. What Danny had first mistaken for just another misstep in the water had unfolded into something far worse than he was prepared to witness. Two off-duty lifeguards, brothers who had been jogging along the shoreline, sprinted into the water without hesitation. They dragged Craig's limp form onto the sand, his left leg mangled and bleeding profusely. One brother applied pressure to the wound while the other called 911. But both could see that Craig was fading fast. Emergency crews arrived within 8 minutes, but Craig had already lost too much blood. Paramedics fought to stabilize him en route, but his pulse faded steadily. He was pronounced dead at the hospital, never regaining consciousness. The investigation made clear what had gone wrong. Craig's open tackle box was found in the surf, unused shrimp bait still inside, showing he hadn't been chumming or doing anything that typically attracts sharks. But the fish oil coating his body told a different story. Texas Parks and Wildlife issued a new advisory warning anglers not to use animal-based oils or fish-scented products while wading in coastal waters, especially during low visibility conditions when sharks rely most on scent. For Craig's fishing circle, the message was painfully clear. At his memorial overlooking the same stretch of shoreline, his friend Danny summed it up. Craig always said instincts beat book smarts. Turns out, facts beat both. Thanks for watching. If today's parade of bad ideas turned deadly entertained you, the next video dives into even more lapses in judgment. See you soon.